Uh, Dennis Page once commented in Further Greek Epigrams in the headnote to an anonymous poem mocking philosophers that we'll look at in a moment on handout 1, and I'm sure it was tongue-in-cheek. Hellenistic epigrammatists seldom mention any school of philosophy except Cynics or any other philosopher except Diogenes. And that may be true enough, but in gathering the evidence, we shouldn't be surprised to learn that thinkers and philosophers of various schools from all periods, Seven Sages and Pre-Socratics to the early Byzantine period, occasioned several poems of their own. In preparation for this paper, I assembled a corpus of epigrams about philosophers, largely drawn from the Greek anthology, which less often than you think, and even then almost never without controversy, are epigrams by philosophers. So epigrams by Philodemus and those attributed to Plato, for example, may therefore be left aside. I'm looking at moments, what I'm trying to do is look at moments in poetry where they confront philosophy specifically, and I'm doing that kind of in the Roman tradition, and this project grew out of my working my way through the same phenomenon in the Greek tradition. So the remaining epigrams, which I claim is by no means exhaustive, I divided by poet and philosopher or philosophical school, and then I set about doing a largely synchronic reading to see what elements or themes cut across the corpus, while trying to remain sensitive to obvious differences in the choices of individual poets and their doctrines and biographical traditions. So in what follows, I want to read a number of these epigrams with you to mark motifs used by several poets and cut across particular schools. In particular, I'm interested in the Soma Suke motif. And by and large, I prefer to work poem by poem rather than offering systematic results by school, because in a number of cases this has already been done, but in all cases each school would really deserve its own study. I will, however, dilate at the conclusion on a number of epigrams on Plato and the Academy, because they're particularly rich, consistent, and illustrate some points that I'm trying to make. As the garland assemblers and anthologists intuited, Greek literary epigram often traffics in species of epideictic. It comes as no surprise, then, that a great number of epigrams about philosophers are epitaphs found in Book 7 of the Greek anthology, or that many, but not all of those, come to us by way of Diogenes Laertius. And I hope the fact that many of these epigrams pass through the hands of Diogenes won't sour you on the prospect of drawing conclusions about our corpus, since whatever his faults as a biographer or poet, and he was a uniquely bad poet, he certainly knew the epigrammatic tradition well. Epitaphs for philosophers in particular offer literary epigrammatists a number of attractive opportunities. One, they allow poets to indulge an interest in a philosopher's biography, and two, to tie that biography to the philosopher's metaphysical doctrines, very often regarding the nature of the soul. A very few of these epigrams may even be authentic, but most are fiction, that is, literary epigram. In addition to epitaphs, we'll find other standard epideictic genres and a variety of anecdotes that fit less cleanly into a standard typology. So, on to examples. I want to start off by looking at strategies of praise and blame with philosophers who are often cited approvingly or singled out as cautionary tales. So let's start with the blame, shall we? In a number of poems, we can detect an outright hostility, an anti-intellectualism of a sort with which you might not be entirely unfamiliar. I come from Virginia. In an anonymous epigram, Page dates to the mid-2nd century BC, we encounter human and contempt for philosophers in equal measure. And this is handout number 1. And so you have the Greek in front of you, and most of the time I'm just going to translate, but I'll try to point out words that are often bold-faced. Those who raise eyebrows in scorn with nutcracker chins and noses, rearers of beards big as coarse hair sacks, and snatchers of dishes, who utterly shroud themselves in their cloaks, bare of foot and bleary of eye, who nightly eat in secret, by night roaming to and fro, deceivers of youths, and who talk in questions about syllables, philosophers of foolish doctrines, seekers of virtue. Grandiloquently addressed, our philosophers are never asked for anything, except perhaps implicitly, perhaps to get lost. They are globally dismissed, ridiculous, hypocritical, not different than the hostility found perhaps in Aristophanes' Clouds. And yet, as in Plato's Apology, there remains a hint of danger, miraki ex apatai. Philosophers are nocturnal, ridiculous, and not quite harmless. Moving to handout number 2. In a second Meleagrian poet, Phanius, philosophy is attacked again as a vain pursuit. Eugenes of Lapithae threw away, and here I'm paraphrasing, numerous implements associated with barbering. And skipping down to line 5, leaving all those behind and his shop, his kureion, he leapt as a gatherer of the garden, Kepalagos, to Epicurus's house, where he heard the lyre like a donkey. And he would have perished of hunger, I think, had he not loved running back, the palindromia. Now, whatever philosophical concept palindromia may refer to beyond its literal reference makes little difference. Gal Page kind of throw up their hands. This is largely a crack at the aspirational behaviors of common folk. It's possible Phanius also takes aim at a specific philosophical sect, like the Epicureans, but here I don't think it matters much whether Eucrates listens donkey-like, haposonos, to Stoics or Epicureans or academics. If you want to keep eating, you should stick to things more practical than philosophy. And a third example of blame I list under handout number 3. Philosophy takes it on the chin by the Meleagrian poet Automedon, who advises a bachelor as follows. Automedon counts various human blessings, and I'm paraphrasing again, not being in debt, not marrying, and if you don't have children, and if you do marry, at least marry somebody who will die efficiently so that you can get the dowry quickly. And skipping down to line 4, knowing this, taute dos, be wise, sophos isti. You can see this idea of knowledge, eidos, and this idea of reappropriating the vocabulary that the philosophers have arrogated and made their special province. That there must be some kind of sophia that is real, true, genuine, and outside of the specific province of philosophers. Sophos isti. And let Epicurus seek in vain, maten zeten, where the void is, tokenon, and what atoms are. Now, here we might interpret this as primarily a poke at Epicureans, but I think Automedon's joke only works if Epicurus stands as a type. Automedon offers simple, practical, ethical wisdom, which if you have to have any part of philosophy, that's the part you want to keep. This right knowledge, this wisdom, taute dos, this sophos, staying financially secure and not marrying unless you expect to become a rich widower, is preferable to the time and other resource-wasting activities like, say, speculative philosophy. The choice of Epicurus in this instance is not without its advantages, since his objects of study, tokenon and haimonades, are entirely appropriate objects of research for the recipient of this protreptic. Emptiness and simplicities are exactly the sort of useless things a philosopher vainly pursues, and in the case of tokenon, it is at least a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, in this context, blame tends to come from those who have no use for philosophy, though occasionally we find poets factionally ridiculing one philosophical sect while praising another. And I include, as handout number 4, a reference to Athenaeus that illustrates that, where Stoics are preferred to Epicureans. And in numerous poems about Diogenes, you can see a particular adherence to the Cynics. The Cynics there seem isolated from other schools for particular praise, though this might be might be thought a special case because the Cynics were something of an anti-philosophy. Now turning to praise. Praise, predictably, is rarely universal. There is no Boethius in Greek epigram. Epigrammatists tend to isolate individual philosophers, the sophoi, or schools for praise. Among the Sophoi, epigrammatists count the 7 sages, which I line up under handout number 6, and philosophers of virtually every period. And I put a selection of those as handout number 7. But we can start our pass by citing a trivial example by a certain Menander. This is handout number 8, who introduces Epicurus like this. He says, Chaire Naiclids, sons of Naicles, double offspring of which one of you protected his country from slavery, dolosuna, but the other protected him from ignorance, afrosuna. And it's not a particularly good poem. Menander finds sufficient inspiration in the simple coincidence of 2 worthy Athenians sharing the same name for a father, same patronymic. Menander nevertheless celebrates Epicurus as a liberator of the Athenians from ignorance, afrosuna, which we may infer is itself a kind of slavery, doulosuna. Implicitly, here we find the encomiastic staple that's common to praise for all philosophers, which is to register. Here it's registered in its opposite, afrosuna, but frequently we will find it figured as Sophiae, Sophrosine, Metis, and the sort. That is their virtue. And to continue with the praise, we see that philosophers are not just reckoned sometimes as good, as public benefactors and culture heroes, but occasionally they're even too good for this world. Consider Antipater of Thessalonica and his epigram on Socrates, which is handout number 9. Is it possible that one so great, hotosos, slip beneath shallow soil? Anyone looking at you, Socrates, will find fault with the lack of judgment, akrisiae, lack of wisdom, of the Greeks. Pitiless, nelees, those who dispatch the best man, hoi ton aristonapolis. And we get this motif of the aristos, a good man. Give nothing to shame, eidos. Giving nothing to shame. Such often are the kekropidae. This time, as opposed to in the Menander epigram, Athens is not liberated by philosophy, but instead expels divine virtue, the divine virtue of eidos, through her own ignorance, akrisiae. Now, Diogenes Laertius extends this idea in an epigram on Socrates. This is handout number 10. Drink, now that you're in Zeus's house, for truly a god said you really are wise, Sophos. And wisdom, Sophia, is a divine thing, is a godlike thing. From Athenians you receive simply hemlock, but they eventually would all drink that up. They all eventually drink that up by your mouth. Now I'll leave aside the conceit, labored as it is, about the unintended consequence of giving hemlock to Socrates, which was what they would eventually have to accept, that they would eventually have to accept his arguments as true and were themselves poisoned by his logos. What interests me here is that praise of Socrates has elevated him to his rightful place in Zeus's abode as an immortal. Though his body succumbed to poison, his soul will live on. Now, and with any other notable who receives an epitumbium, you see that distinction of the soma psyche, you might not think twice. But Emigrammatus, with a modicum of philosophical learning, found it hard to resist marrying biographical detail, philosophical doctrine, and poetic occasion, in this case, death. Epigrammatists were particularly drawn to Plato, for instance, and I suspect there's a lot I can learn from Professor Menlein Robert, whose work I vow to get to know better hereafter. Plato's theory of the soul as articulated in the Phaedo and elsewhere must have surprised and provoked many learned ancient sensibilities. But it's not only in Plato. We'll eventually get to the Plato, but it's not found just there. Diogenes Laertius naturally gives us the following critique of the Pythagorean theory of the soul. And this is handout 11. You are not alone in keeping your hands away from sold things, emsukon. Nay, we do it too. For who touches sold things, Pythagoras? See, whenever something's boiled, roasted, or salted, we too eat something that no longer has a soul. So, trivial, but, it is trying to incorporate in a funerary context a theory of the soul. And there are other examples that I include underneath handout 11. Likewise, though, we find two anonymous epigrams on the Stoic Epictetus. And these are this is handout 12, A and B. Store up the metis of Epictetus in your thumos, so that you may enter heavenly recesses, making light elafridzon, your psyche, on its lofty path from the earth. And 12b, whoever puts in practice the wise desire of Epictetus smiles, becoming calm like the sea, galeniaon, on the sea of life. And after life's voyage, he reaches the heavenly vault and the starry watchtower. Now, in both epigrams, the poet or poets adopt the premises of Stoicism by submitting to a process of therapy, that is, by internalizing through reading Stoic precepts. The initiate becomes calm like the sea, galeniaon, and lightens his soul, psychen elafridzon, to elevate it from its imprisonment on earth on up to its eventual destiny, the heavenly recesses. We might also note in 9.207, that's 12a, the first of the two passages, that the separation of psyche from Gaia, and as well as the praise of wisdom, metis. Note also that this is the first pair of poems where the fate of the psyche and implicitly the fate of the body are fairly front-forward contrasted. And note also that we'd have to date this to some time after Epictetus. So we don't just find this impulse of marrying theme, occasion, and subject matter with philosophical doctrines. But Plato's soul and his theory of do figure prominently in several epigrams, and it's to these I want to turn now and focus on for the balance of my time. We may begin with an anonymous epigram. This is handout 13, where the dialogue, the Phaedo, addresses us as follows. If Plato didn't write me, then there must be two Platos. I bear all the blooms of Socratic dialogues. But Panaetius made me out to be spurious, nothos. Whoever reckoned also the soul to be mortal will also reckon me to be spurious. Now, this epigram may not have been written much later than Panaetius' lifetime, who died not long before the publication of Meleager's anthology. But, it's hard to know, and you might assume that, or you might wonder rightly, when an interest in Panaetius and the authenticity of Plato's dialogues might be of more interest. We know that Panaetius was read by Neoplatonists, for example, as not a Stoic, but as a Platonist. But this epigram turns on the idea that Panaetius had declared Phaedo spurious, not because he didn't accept the arguments of the Phaedo per se, and thought them inconsistent with true Platonism, but because he in fact believed the soul to be mortal. Again, commonality of theme. Now, the most famous reflex of this interest, however, is Callimachus' epigram on Cleombrotus of Ambracia, which is handout 14. After saying farewell, son, Cleombrotus the Ambracian leapt from a high wall to his Hades, and not because he saw any trouble, any kakon that was the cause of, worth making the decision to leap, but merely because he had perused Analexamenos, a single writing about the soul, which we assume to be the Phaedo. Now here Callimachus offers a real tour de force. Cleombrotus, otherwise unknown, may well be the Cleombrotus who was often Aegon at the time of Socrates' death, which we know from the Phaedo 59c. If so, he's returned to the fold by adopting a curious strategy to test his students' Plato's theory of the soul after merely perusing one particular writing by hurling himself off a rooftop. And while we may prove the greater fools for not choosing not to follow Cleombrotus's footsteps, light as they may be, off of the roof, the joke is certainly on him in this epigram. Galpage's remarks on analexomenos, as meaning having merely perused, fits the tone. Cleombrotus is rash, the decision curious and ill-advised. And so far as I can tell, Callimachus doesn't reject Plato's doctrine per se, but he doesn't take the idea of the immortality of the soul as a natural given that you can just trade upon, that it will naturally fly to the firmament. So rather than directing a poem at Plato, where he could test his own theory, he instead gets Cleombrotus of Ambracia to have to test it out for him, which is convenient if you can possibly manage it. Now, Callimachus's epigram may date to around the 270s. Some put it later by a bit, but which incidentally was around the time Arcesilaus was transforming the academy. But nearly 8 centuries later, Agathias will rewrite Callimachus 53, taking apart now, this time, the 2nd century Middle Platonist Nicostratus. And this is handout 15. Someone asked Nicostratus, another Aristotle, the equal of Plato, straw splitter, scandalium of Frostes, of the loftiest philosophy, Sophiae, such things about the soul, toia peripsyches. How should we describe the soul? Is it mortal, thnete, or rather deathless, athanatos? Is it to be classed among numinally intelligible things, in noetai-tois, or things perceptible by the senses, in leptois, or is it both? He perused again on Alexato, his books on metaphysics, Hybibloi to Meteorum, both Aristotle's work on the soul, and having renewed his acquaintance with Plato's sublimity in the Phaedo, armed himself with every source with complete certainty, passa atrecie. Then, wrapping his cloak about him and stroking down the end of his beard, he gave utterance to the solution. If, in fact, the nature of the soul is a whole, and I don't know that for sure, which doesn't really lend itself to a lot of trust when you're a philosopher. I don't really know, one way or the other. It's either completely mortal or it's immortal. It's either of a thick nature or it's immaterial. And when you get to Acheron, then you're going to know the unerring truth, just like Plato did. But if you want to clear things up a bit sooner, you can always imitate the boy Cleombrotus of Ambracia and hurl your body from the roof. And then you'd immediately recognize yourself alone, apart from the body, and leaving behind that which you seek, which I think means something like, now, you won't have any more questions to bother you at that point. Now, though others think that Agathias' praise of Nicostratus as another Aristotle and Plato's equal sincere, I'm afraid I don't. The repetition of Analexito, the citation of Phaedo, and the citation of Cleombrotus' curious example are the obvious points of contact with Callimachus, to which Agathias added Aristotelian language about soul talk, a reference to the De Anima by title, and a perfectly maddening ambivalence on the whole subject. Whereas Plato at least had offered Cleombrotus a solid promise, he'll be alive when you die, Nicostratus gives his interlocutor only a set of possibilities and probabilities. Could he really not do any better than you're going to find out when you get there? I want to conclude my exploration of philosophers and Greek literary epigram by looking at a few poems by Diogenes that Diogenes Laertius says were inscribed on Plato's tomb. They are handouts 16 through 19. Handout 16 is as follows. Eagle, why ever have you climbed atop the tomb? Until you are gazing at the starry home of which of the gods? I am the image, the eikon of Plato's psyche that has flown off to Olympus, but his carnal body, his gegenes soma, Attic land, holds. Once again, we have the soma psyche motif. The carnal body, the gegenes soma, is trapped in the earth, the ge, while Plato's appropriately immortal soul, psyche, has flown to Olympus. And this is consistent with the thematics that we've observed so far, but quite apart from the fact that Diogenes calls this particular epigram later, I think we could already guess that based on when that motif appears more frequently in the tradition. To my knowledge, no one calls immortal the soul of a philosopher who argues for the immortality of the soul before the epigrams that we read on Epictetus. And those epigrams are, of course, later than Epictetus, which is later than this. In handout 17, we have Simmias. In Sophrosine excelling mortals and in just character, here lies a man divine, Aristocles. If anyone from all, that means universally, acquires great praise for Sophiae, this man gets the most, and he doesn't carry off Thonos, too. Now, Gow Page won't assign this to Simmias of Rhodes on the very light authority of C in an erasure. It's anonymous in the Planudian anthology as well as in Diogenes Laertius. It's not clearly Meleagrian. The philosopher is praised for his virtues, Sophrosune. Aristocles, this alternate tradition of a name for for Plato, which gets this idea of Aristos, he who gets his glory from being Aristos, is in essence and appropriately, he is divine, he's theos, while his body is trapped on earth, anthade ketai. So reflexes of that same okay. And I could go through the remaining examples, but I think I am running out of time, and so I think I will stop right there, and thank you very much for your patience.